poetry or good literature is an invitation into a deeper relationship with life, a deeper reflection on the meaning of one's life, on what one is caring about, and to borrow a turn of phrase from a Mary Oliver poem, what one might intend to do with one's wild and precious life.
Welcome to Rise Leaders Radio. I'm your host, LeeAnn Mallory. As a leadership coach, I work inside organizations and I focus on helping leaders achieve their whole person potential and meaningfully contribute to their organization's mission. With this podcast, I share leadership best practices, developmental approaches, and stories of exemplary leaders. Today's episode with Rick Voirin covers a lot of ground. Rick has a unique blend of intellect, heart, and spirit, and a way of bringing all of this forward that leaves his audience, and that includes me, contemplating the world in more complex and nuanced ways. Rick's work has taken him across the globe, and he's worked with executives from the Fortune 500 to mid-market CEOs and nonprofit leaders. He is chairman at Stegan Leadership Academy and also an adjunct professor at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. We talk about poetry and how to use poetry in leadership settings during this episode. I've created a guide and have linked to several of the resources that we mention in the episode, all in the show notes. Here we go. Hello, Rick.
Hey, LeeAnn. How are you?
I am fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. Sort of a last-minute request.
I think you and I have a good time anytime we're in conversation, so I'll take the last-minute ones or the planned requests.
Thank you. Well, I want to set some context here. So a few episodes ago, I spoke with the CEO and the chief people officer of a mid-market company about how they were approaching conversations about race and equality within their organization. And one of the things that impressed me most about what they were doing was the fact that they didn't wait till they had a perfect solution.
Yeah.
Things were happening and they just went into action. And I began my internal creative process for how I wanted to design an episode around this. And of course, you kept coming to mind because I know that you include poetry a lot in your work with leaders. And in fact, I have not one, but probably several memories of you just standing up in front of a group of leaders and reciting a poem that came to your mind just from heart or from memory. I'm going to call Rick because I think this will be great, because I think incorporating what you use or what you do in your work, and me too, could be a really juicy conversation. And I want to talk about you just for a bit and say,
Okay.
So we're on Zoom. We're on Zoom and Rick is blushing a little bit. So Rick is a Renaissance man. You're a musician, philosopher, teacher, business person, a computer science major, and a dear friend for almost 30 years now. That's how long we've known each other. And so it feels really, really, really special to have you here. I'm wondering, we're going to talk about the poem, Start Close In. Can we just start by you reading it?
Sure. I told you I could probably recite it, but when I'm put under the pressure of performance, I might botch it a little bit. So I will read it, if you don't mind, LeeAnn, because I think it might play into our conversation, and especially the way that I use poetry. I'd like to read it somewhat in the style in which David will typically recite poems. Right. So there's a recitation that conveys something a little bit different depending on an individual's capacity to listen, a little different than simply reading it. So I'd like to read it more or less in the way that I can hear David reciting it in my own head. Okay?
Perfect.
Start close in. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing. Close in. The step you don't want to take. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing. Close in. The step you don't want to take. Start with the ground you know. The pale ground beneath your feet. Your own way of starting the conversation. Start with your own question. With your own question. Give up on other people's questions. Don't let them smother something simple. To hear another's voice, follow your own voice. To hear another's voice, follow your own voice. Wait until that voice becomes a private ear listening to another. Start right now, right now. Take a small step. You can call your own. Don't follow someone else's heroics. Be humble and focused. Start close in. Don't mistake that other for your own. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing. Close in, the step you don't want to take.
Oh, thank you. I actually just closed my eyes a little bit and listened to your interpretation in the way that you read it. So there was even an interpretation there at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to now back out of the poem just for a moment. I'm curious about why and how you use poetry when you're working with leaders. So what is the value of bringing in poetry when you're working with some pretty type A personalities?
Yeah, could I tell you maybe three really quick short stories that that were likely the genesis and the subsequent nurturing and watering of this practice of the use of poetry for my own growth and development and for the work that I do with others.
Absolutely.
And the first poem wasn't a great one, but it was shared with me years and years ago. Actually, it was a bit before you and I met. I was doing some counseling during a particularly tumultuous and challenging period of personal growth and development. And my therapist shared a poem with me. I don't even quite remember the exact name of the poem, but I think it was like self-growth in 5 verses. And the essence of it was, I'm walking down a road, there's a hole in the road, I fall in, it's deep and dark, right? And then verse 2 is as I'm walking down the same road, there's that hole, I fall in it again, I figure out how to get out of it, and by the last one, I'm walking down a different road. And the idea that someone captured in poetry the experience, the direct experience that I was having of just like, I kept making the same personal, professional mistake like over and over again. And I thought, like, I'm just not learning anything. And Roy was his name. Roy shared that poem with me. Oh, there actually is a path here. And I can actually see that the hole that I'm in doesn't feel as dark as it did the very first time that I fell in it. And I actually remember that I knew how to get out of it. Now that I look at it, there's a way to climb out of this, and I can choose differently tomorrow. Right? That was back in, I'm going to say 1989. Right? Fast forward just a little bit. When I was back in the day, I worked for Anderson Consulting, and just about 93, I want to say 92, 93, lead partner at Anderson, a guy named George Shaheen, went off to Utah and sat in the mountaintop lodge with Stephen Covey and, found the Covey religion and came back and unleashed it on all of Anderson's 78,000 employees. And I got to be a part of the first tranche of leaders and facilitators to go through the training with Covey. And in that Covey program, the guy, Dave Gettleman was his name, led the program, used poetry extensively to highlight something. A lot of his poems were snippets from the epics like Homer's Odyssey, for example. But he used particular pieces of poem to highlight something. So an artistic, you might say, or a more abstract rendering of what we might find as commonalities or everyday life. And it reinforced for me this idea that there are ways of seeing things that transcend our everyday experience of reality, the black and white ways in which we see things and make sense of things. And if we had access to other ways of seeing, that we might also then have other ways of making sense of meaning and therefore expanding our capacity to relate more fully with life. Right? And that's early 90s. And this is post, extensive counseling and therapy. So I was still on a pretty a keen knife's edge there of my own learning and growth and development. So fast forward to 2005. I was reading a lot of poetry through that time and starting to weave it in, but I was reading it and using it mostly as it was written. I was doing some work with the executive team at Ford, and it was after Alan Mulally joined Ford from Boeing, and he brought David Whyte in for a senior executive meeting, like a poet. I was tacitly familiar with David Whyte at the time, like one of his poems, but not a lot. And David came in, and Alan introduced him as somebody that helped them launch the 777 with a poem, but then went on to say that David's philosophical approach to life and the way that he rendered his experience of life and the things that he could think about in poetry opened up vistas for him, Alan Mulally, that hadn't previously been available through business books or through the everyday corporate life or even the casual conversations that he had with others. That something came online for him in his conversations with David and in the poetry. And David recited a poem that he had written for the 777 called Working Together. And I had an out-of-body experience, the world of like, there is so much more here. First of all, it doesn't hurt that he has a wonderful Irish lilt.
Right.
So that's wonderful to begin with to listen. But his repetitious, but not exactly repeating, his emphasis on certain words, the way that he used metaphor to convey something intangible that became tangible was it was profound. It wasn't that I decided then and there that I would use poetry, but then and there I was changed by it. And I've used it ever since. I've probably recited that particular poem at least 1,000 times in different settings because of its profundity of it, especially in the context of teams and how they work together. So I started, we'll call it 2004 or 5. I don't remember the exact year, but it was in that time frame. It's been a part of everything, every program or every coaching relationship that I've had since.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know your story, and it makes me think of, how I came to it as well. Mine was through when I was doing all of my, not just my coach certification. So I have 2 different coach certifications, but actually even before that in the mid 90s, when EDS was doing leadership transformation work, and we were working with Peter Kestenbaum and Fred Kaufman and Peter Senge and kind of those folks. And Kestenbaum does as well, and he uses a lot of music. And then Fred Kaufman also uses a lot of poetry and storytelling. And I'm looking down at the first thing from David Whyte that I ever read, which was The Heart Aroused, another just fabulous leadership book. And when I went through my coach certification at Strozzi Institute with Richard Strozzi Heckler, someone asked him one time, how do you learn about the human condition? And he said, read good literature. And that has just stuck with me. And obviously, poetry is good literature. And it pulls me out of kind of an everyday linear analytical way of thinking into being more metaphorical and getting in touch with perspectives and ways of seeing something or relating to something that I would not typically engage in. And so it's more, feels more whole brained. It's a broader perspective. It's art and beauty. And I find that that's kind of a universal experience.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense to me. And I mean, what's coming up for me hearing that? Well, first of all, it's like I'm grateful that you and I connected in such a random way 30 years ago, nearly, and that we've managed to stay connected despite many times where oceans separated us, et cetera. And our journeys have been amazingly similar. And so just listening to you now with that and coming on to poetry through programs where you were yourself engaged in learning and development. I mean, you said something. Just before you said this, this thought rose in me. You said art and beauty. And I said, yeah, the Greek notion of the good, the true, and the beautiful, right?
Right.
Which are different ways that human beings can relate to each other and relate to reality, right? The good is what you and I collectively determine to be good, right? So in relationship to each other, something out here, whether it's a moral or an ethical situation or something that we care about, we can decide that that's good. And that's a function of you and I, or all of us in some kind of conversation where we've arrived at something where we intend to care about a shared or collective thing. And that would be the good. The true in the Greek Socratic Platonic sense are the objective facts. My sense would be that in the business world, that we have so rewarded the ability to wrestle facts to the ground, the rational, logical, empirical mind, right? And the organizational mind where we just collectively decide on this is the next thing that we're going to do, that we've lost touch with beauty, right? And so neither the good nor the true, in this sense, for me, capture the essence of the heart. And while you didn't say this, listening to you, I could feel in my own self, my heart beating. Oh, yeah, there it is. Right? That's what it feels like to be in a relationship. Right? That's what it feels like to listen to something that I care about, or something that I care about, and with someone that I care about. Right? So the beautiful, in the Greek sense, was determined by first the creator, whether the creator was the gods, or the creator was an author or an artist, etc. And then the way that I related with it, right? That the beauty was found inside of me. Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, right? So the beauty is about finding the relational quality in me to the content of the world around me. I mean, relating to it not strictly or merely in a rational way, but feeling it, right? The feeling, the emotional tonal quality of it. So good literature, good art, evokes something from us. It evokes an emotional response that we then have to try to make some kind of semi-rational sense of. And that's where I think the nexus or the intersection here for me of poetry and work in the world is it evokes something deep in us that we wouldn't otherwise have easy access to through facts alone.
Yeah, it's very perspective expanding. And I'm just remembering now, I did an interview a few months back with a woman, Bonnie Pittman. She was once the director of the Dallas Museum of Art.
Yeah.
And she has a couple of programs now, and she actually takes physicians into art museums to help them with their observation skills through observing art.
Yeah.
It enhances how they are with patients, what they're able to see in a whole person rather than just a diagnosis or a disease. And so there are just so many uses for art and beauty. Yeah. So when you are using, I know a lot of times you just spontaneously break out into a poem. Do you ever have a way of walking people through introducing a piece of poetry and then walking them through how they can relate to it or reflect on it in meaningful ways? Would you share that?
Sure. And this is totally co-opted from David Whyte's work. And I could be, and I have been at times in some of our programs, been accused of being a fanboy. But it's not just David Whyte. It's one of my favorite singer-songwriters. And now we're going to get into the world of David, a guy named David Wilcox. And the thing that they share is that they use metaphor to convey some aspect of their experience with living and being in the world. And they're storytellers. So David will often tell a story, recite the poem, and tell another story. David Wilcox will often tell a story about what he's working with in life, because he would say the songs that he sings are really for himself, right? And he's not trying to preach anything. He's actually trying to talk to himself. So he'll tell the story about what's up for him. He'll sing the song, and then he'll come back and say, right while he's still playing the song before he sings the final chorus again, he'll say, oh, yeah, it's a little bit like this and it's a little bit like that. So what he's doing, the way that I would come to understand what both of them are doing, is they're offering entry points or handholds for how to relate to it. In other words, you could relate to it just as it is, or you could say, how does this relate to me? How does this relate to life? Or what's coming up for me? right? And this ties very closely with the Jewish and the Christian sense of reading sacred texts. Right? How do you relate to something that's potentially conveying or has the potential to convey deep meaning to you? Right? First approximation are just the facts, black and white. What are the sounds? Second approximation is what's coming up. Like, what do I notice arising in me as a result of it? The third one is going to be, what is it in me that shows up now as some sense of meaning as a result of those things? And then the fourth sense, or the moving on sense, is what do I now want to do with that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you'll indulge me,
I want to add something
sure.
a little bit to that the very first. Okay. You said the first approximation is just kind of the black and white, the scripture, the words, etc. And as I was reviewing, well, how do I do it? How do I go through this? The first part for me too, the first step is, I would say, even observation.
Yep.
Which is basically what you're saying. Yep. And I realized that as I started thinking about this poem from more the fact, observable standpoint, that I remembered, okay, it was written by David Whyte, a Welsh man, in this period of time. It's this long. This particular poem has a visual structure to it that's very narrow, so it's a short poem, but even the structure looks like starting close in.
Yeah.
So even that, and then he uses the word start 6 times.
Mm-hmm.
So even just looking at truly, like you said, the black and white, what's very observable, me remembering like who wrote it, and the fact that he's a nature lover and that he was a guide in the Galapagos. And so he comes with a particular perspective. And so even bringing those facts or the context about him into the poem reminded me from where he might have been writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so even something that can feel really dry, like step 1, observation, or black and white approximation, can be really juicy. Like you start looking at scripture. Well, when was it written and who wrote it and what was going on at that time? So like Walt Whitman, he was a nurse in the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And once you start thinking about all the facts or the context of the people, then for me, the poem starts taking on a new meaning, because you go, that person's perspective or part of it.
Yeah. So in the Jewish and Christian faiths, a prescribed structure for engaging with sacred texts. If you generalize this idea of, going from sacred text to just going with reality, and then you now specialize it again back to poetry, it still holds as far as I can tell. But they both share this first step in the Christian lectio divina. It's lectio. It is what's the text? It's in some sense, what's the black and white of the text? In the Jewish tradition, I'm less familiar with this, and we'll probably butcher the pronunciations of it, but the content's the same, is peshat, or surface, right? So what's the text or what's the surface? You can just what is being presented to me right now, which would include other facts if they're known, right? If they're not known, I may have to go in search of those. And the second step is in the lectio divina is meditatio, meditate on, which brings context in, right? In the Jewish sense, it's remez, right? Which is also the deep allegorical meaning of it. So you go from surface to the meditation of context and meaning. Right? And what you're describing there is almost perfectly that kind of 2-step process where they're relating to each other. They don't happen sequentially. If we really engage something, whether it's a poem or a piece of art or a piece of literature or something that's happening on a screen in front of us in a movie, first approximation is just the way the information lands in our senses. And then what starts to show up as we relate with that happens like in a back and forth conversation continually.
Yeah, it's very iterative and associative for me. It's like it just kind of keeps on looping through, and I gather more meaning the more I reflect on it. Or it takes on a different meaning depending on where I am in life as well.
Yes. Yeah. We started this conversation with how to use this as leaders and why. And here's what I would say from my own experience of my life. And then relating with those that I've served, for the better part of the last 20 plus years. In my own life, most of what happened around me, whether it was poetry or art or everyday life or even human relationships, were all at best surface manifestations in my experience. I took the facts in, I understood what the facts were, and I moved on. It was like, how do I get on to the next thing? There was very little deep consideration of how life was arising in me right now, what was showing up in my world as a result of being in relationship to anything in front of me or around me. And I didn't pause. I just simply didn't pause. I didn't take it in. And because of that, not surprisingly, the experience that the vast majority of folks around me had of me was being aloof, standoffish, distant, non-relational, which was probably true. It didn't feel true to me, but it was probably true.
I can imagine transactional as well.
Yeah,
that word comes up for me as well.
Right. So, no sense of the other in me, and no sense that the other had that I cared. That was part of the emotional, turmoil that I had to go through in my late 20s and early 30s to wake up to the relational quality of life. And this played a big role in it. So I think what we're, this territory that we're in here, and why I care about this is as I think that poetry or good literature is an invitation into a deeper relationship with life, a deeper reflection on the meaning of one's life, on what one is caring about, and to borrow a turn of phrase from a Mary Oliver poem, what one might intend to do with one's wild and precious life.
And the other thing that happens for me with poetry more than anything else is that I find words or descriptions of emotions that I'm feeling that I wasn't able to name.
Yeah.
That is a huge value for me. And I have so much admiration for poets and writers who are able to, they're spending the time kind of mining the depths. I can just imagine myself saying, is it this word, this metaphor? No, what is it? And so just the fact that someone else has taken the time to do that makes my inner life more accessible to me.
Indeed.
And it gives me a different way of interpreting. And this poem right here, Start Close In, as a matter of fact, it will come up for me a lot when I'm feeling challenged. Like if there's a big project or big something ahead of me that I haven't broken it down, or I'm seeing it as, like they say, the big elephant. I make it bigger than it needs to be. And interestingly, I was doing some research on this yesterday, and I came across something that Parker Palmer said about this poem. And he said, when I try to start big, it's probably because I'm seeking an excuse to get out of doing anything. The big stuff is beyond my reach, at least at the moment. But if I start close in, I'll find things I can do right now.
Yeah.
And this is, inspiration from a poem that has everyday life implications.
Yeah. And the interesting thing with really good poems, and by really good poems, I mean ones that have been thoughtfully constructed from the deep well of experience and creativity and the heart and mind of the poet, is that they, in my experience directly, they have the capacity to transmit something different through time, and that there's a context in which we read it. You talked about the context in which David Whyte is even writing it. There's a context in which we read something and relate with something like this. And as our context changes, the meaning that shows up for us changes. So, for example, this Start Close In, it's fascinating that when you reached out to me for this conversation that you led with us, because it's been one that's been forefront for me in a variety of conversations. And largely, I'm in this conversation around the big challenges that we kind of are in the middle of, because there are a bunch of them. One of them that is most directly beyond COVID is, obviously what's going on with race relations, globally, but in America in particular. And the sense that leaders are completely overwhelmed. The same way starting a big project, overwhelmed. One of the things that David does in this program is he says, start close in, take the first thing, start with the first thing, that thing that you really don't want to take, right? It is, don't try to boil the ocean. Start right here and just take one step in the direction that feels a little bit unsafe for you to take, but you know that it's the step you have to take, right? How do you know? You start close in. The one you don't want to take, the conversation that you don't want to have, the door that you don't want to open. Start there and be humble. Don't use other people's questions. You have your own questions. Start with what you're afraid of, what concerns you, what you're caring about. Start right there. So this admonition to just start where you are. You don't have to fix this great big thing called race relations. You do have to work with where your own heart and mind have been closed, right? And open up to the questions that life are giving. So in my world, in my context, this is how this is showing up right now in conversation.
Right. And that's exactly the same context of when it popped into my mind. It's like, because I've also been in these conversations where people just don't know how to get started. And they go way down to what are the policies and procedures and, what are we going to do about it? Don't think about that. Just start right now with what's on your mind, what's on the minds of the people who you care about, who work in your organization, and just start there. You don't have to have it figured out. I'm pausing here to see if there is anything else that I want to say. One thing that I do want to say right now is that I'll take some notes from our conversation here and put those in a document and put them on the website. So my intent is for someone who maybe doesn't read poetry a lot, or someone who's in a position of introducing poetry to others to have some almost cheat sheet. So here's just some ways to do this. And so I had some things written down. You've got some things here, and I'll combine those and provide a guide.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I hope that someone finds something that you and I have said here interesting or opening for them, that they can take their own first step, that they can start close.
Right.
Thank you, David.
Right. Thank you. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you.
And it's lovely how we keep looping through different forms of our relationship. And thank you for being here and supporting me and the podcast and anybody out there who's listening.
Delighted to be in your circle of influence and care. And thank you.
All right. Thank you. If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Rise Leaders Radio on your preferred podcast platform. Your ratings, reviews, and shares are also really appreciated. You can also visit rise-leaders.com for all the resources we talked about today and to work with me if you're committed to making your unique and positive impact. Thank you for listening, and remember, elevate your part of the world.